Good evening, everybody. I'm Scott Dudley. I'm with the Florida League of Cities. We're an organization in Tallahassee that represents all 411 cities in the state of Florida. We do lobbying for them. We do a bunch of other stuff for them. We help them secure insurance. We help them pool together to borrow money for smaller cities, almost like your parents co-signing you a loan for you for your car. We do that for smaller cities that don't have good credit ratings, things like that. We've been around for 100 years, the League of Cities has. We are the voice of Florida's municipalities in Tallahassee and in Washington, D.C. I just wanted to talk real briefly about a program that we started that I think you'd be interested in, because most of you all here are probably pretty engaged in your community. I can imagine the fact that you're here tonight speaks to that. And what we're looking at trying to do is get folks that are engaged in their community already to fight back about some of what's going on in Tallahassee. And as you may know, the Florida legislature has taken to preempting local governments on a lot of decisions, stuff from as overturning elections in Key West about how many people can get off the ships and visit the city of Key West, to development issues, land use issues. The legislature keeps sticking its fingers in local decision making. The League of Cities and this Local Voices United program is trying to bring citizens like yourself into our army of advocacy to help, first of all, to help educate you on what's going on when it's going on. A lot of times what happens is that the big issues are getting covered in the newspaper, and it's all the stuff about the fight between the Senate president or the abortion bill or the whatever it is, whatever the news, whatever the big headline grabbing story is. And that's not a knock on the press. That's what they're supposed to do. They're covering the bigger story. So a lot of what happens to local governments and in terms of the decision-making processes that are happening are going under the radar, and people find out about them after sessions. So what we're trying to do with this Local Voices United program is to try to, the league follows about 500 bills a year. We don't want you to follow 500 bills a year. We pick out 2 or 3 of those bills that have a direct impact on you as citizens in your community, and we advise you when the bills are going to be up, who you need to reach out to, what committee it's going to be in. We draft letters for you. We make it as easy as possible, so we hope that you'll avail yourselves of that. The issue is this, is that when the legislature is preempting local governments, they think that they're holding back all these blue state ideas, and they're trying to keep things in check and whatever, and kind of keep cities in their lanes. But really what they're doing is they're going against the Constitution, because the home rule is in the state Constitution. There are some provisions that allow them to preempt, but it shouldn't be the first order of business. It should be like when we can't decide on how we're going to regulate in a meaningful way or a comprehensive way, and they need to step in, that's when they should do it. But what they're doing now is they're preempting, and they're not leaving anybody in the field to regulate at all. So when they preempt us, they're taking away not only the ability of the cities, but they're leaving no regulation in place at all. So a lot of these things are going hugely unregulated. And the other important point that I want to bring up to you before I sit down and you can continue to eat is that so I talked about that they feel like, they're trying to keep these cities in check and keep the power balance. Well, they're totally disturbing the power balance, because what they're doing is when they preempt a city, what they're doing is they're tying the hands of everyone in this room to have a say in your own community. That's really the bottom line of what's going on. So they talk about all these highbrow, we're just trying to keep cities in check and all that, but they're stripping you of your voice. And that ought to make you mad. It ought to I speak to groups all over the state of Florida, Republican clubs, Democratic clubs, garden clubs, you name it. I go speak to them about this. And people are mad when I'm telling them what's going on. And I don't know, I'm sure many of you in this room, it's probably a higher percentage. You've been to Tallahassee before, I'm sure, and when you get there, they have a long agenda for committee meetings, and they keep the last 5 most controversial bills to the end of the agenda, and they say, all right, for the next 40 minutes, we're going to handle these 5 bills. There's 100 people in the audience that want to testify on those bills, and as you're coming up, they're saying, please make your comments brief. You've got a minute. You've driven from St. Pete or from the Keys or from Pensacola or from wherever it is, and they give you a minute. I'm not an expert in a lot of topics, but the ones I am, sometimes it takes me about a minute to credential myself to make sure that they know I'm not up there spouting off, and they're doing this. And so the idea is they don't want to hear from you. So what we're doing is we're taking away, we're going to try to find a way around them not wanting to hear you, which is to weigh in through phone calls, texts, letters, all that stuff, and make it really easy on issues that are going to affect you in your day-to-day life. The placement of cell phone infrastructure, the Live Local Act that they just passed, where now you can, it's basically said density and height requirements are out the window, the restrictions in your city. So they're doing a lot of stuff that's just going under the radar, and we're trying to put it on your radar. And I hope that you'll look at the little handout that I put on your table. There's a QR code on there. I hope you'll use that QR code, get involved. We will be, we've got a Facebook page that we're really active on. We'll send it during session. We're going to try to keep you all up to speed on what's going on within the legislative process that's going to be affecting your life. And we want to help you get your voice back. And that's really what Local Voices United is about. I'm heading up that program, and I appreciate the opportunity tonight to be here. And I know you all are doing great work in your communities, and I commend you for that, and I urge you to keep up the great work. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Do you want to come with me to Tallahassee for my tally trek? I feel like you could do the talking.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll hold you to it.
Anybody is in other groups, if you're in Rotary or JCs or whatever, garden clubs, call me. I'm happy. I would love to come talk to that group for sure. So
Thank you so much for your passion. We really appreciate it. And now it's time for our keynote. It's been a really long day, but you've all stayed with us so far and been so engaged, and we appreciate it. I'm happy to have Tim Dutton come up to introduce our keynote speaker.
So you know that when it's after the happy hour and after the dinner and at the end of a day that started a long time ago, you have to have a lot of confidence in this next speaker. And we do. And I'm going to make this really quick. Matt has a wonderful resume. He has jobs, 2 of which had the word innovation in them, which has got to be something special. And he's going to talk about a really, really wonderful topic, which has to do with looking backwards and looking forward around the issues of civic engagement. Matt Leighninger.
Thank you, Tim. So, yes. So I spent a lot of time, pretty much my whole career, in public engagement. So I'm very, very familiar with newsprint and Post-it notes, and I've got a lot of experience with that. And at one time, years and years ago, I'd come back from a meeting I'd facilitated with all this newsprint and all these Post-it notes, and I was trying to, do the notes and get them on my computer and transmit them to the board or whatever. And it was a time in my life where my wife and I were kind of trading off childcare responsibilities for a 6-month-old baby, our 3rd son. And so here I am trying to do work and childcare at the same time. Never a good idea. And I'm up there in my office, and he's with me, and I've got newsprint on the wall, I've got it on my desk, I've got it on the floor, and I'm trying to get everything down. And I finally turn around, and the baby is eating the newsprint. And I told this story to my very wise board chair of the organization, and she said, well, and I said, we had these great ideas that we generated at this meeting, and my baby was eating them. And she said, well, as long as they're well digested. So as a dinner keynote, I am here to help you digest all of the ideas that you absorbed today, all these wonderful slides and words and figures and all of the wonderful food you've just eaten. And my job is to help you do that agreeably without putting you to sleep. So I will do my best. And by the way, that baby is now a 16-year-old, and he's 6'2", so eating the newsprint clearly didn't didn't do too much to stunt his growth. And I'm going to do this as kind of entertainingly as I can. I'm going to tell this story, or a part of this kind of recent history that Tim talked about, and then I'm going to turn to you guys, and we're going to talk to one another and share some ideas with the whole crowd about your versions of the story, your additions to it, your challenges to it, your critiques, whatever you want to talk about. Then I'll come back and give you another chapter, and we'll come back to you, and so on. And I promise we'll be done no later than 2 a.m. So, by the way, I joke about that, but on this agenda, it does say 8:45 recess. It doesn't say adjourn for the evening. It says recess. So clearly at 9, we're having volleyball. All right. So what I want to give you is kind of a recent history. What have we learned in the last 25 years or so from the history of public engagement on race and equity? And also the waves of civic innovation that have taken place, partly inspired by that work, partly inspired by other things. And most importantly, as Tim said, where do we go from here? What is the next chapter in this history? What chapter do we want to kind of influence or form together? So I'm originally from Kalamazoo, Michigan. I have worked in this field for Everyday Democracy, the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, Public Agenda, the National Conference on Citizenship, and now the Center for Democracy Innovation at the National Civic League. Clearly, I am just trying to work for every single organization in America that has civic or democracy or citizenship in the title. I'm going one by one through all of them. I also am struck by the history of some of these groups, and I'm kind of working my way back through time. Public Agenda was formed in 1975. National Conference on Citizenship that Cameron runs was formed in 1953. The National Civic League was founded by Teddy Roosevelt in 1894. I think I might have gotten to my limit. I don't know there's another organization older than that, so I think I may be stuck. But I think what's helpful potentially about these organizations, their histories and their future, is that they can be and are part of the civic furniture of America. They're part of the infrastructure. They're natural conveners and hubs for people to learn from one another, to support each other, because we know that this work that we're doing is incredibly diffuse, decentralized, diverse, and that's what's exciting about it, and also super frustrating, because people in their communities and their professions are feeling like they're all alone. And so we need to kind of have hubs and kind of clearinghouses of information that give people some of the knowledge they might need, the skills they might need, and the connections that can support them to do more and better work. The current organization that I'm at, the Center for Democracy Innovation, was actually a project that incubated at the National Conference on Citizenship, and we have now kind of moved it to the National Civic League. But basically, the intent is to kind of look forward from the great history of the National Civic League. The Civic League actually was part of the first big wave of the early 20th century of civic innovation. The National Civic League, starting in like 1902, created the first model city charter, upheld the city manager form of government, all these different sorts of ballot initiatives, referenda, all those kind of early civic democracy innovations. The center is trying to take that to the next level, and we're kind of looking at the innovations of today, figuring out how we can help sustain democracy by helping people strengthen civic infrastructure, scale it by providing more opportunities for a wider range of people to be involved in public decision making, and measuring it, and particularly through the ratings and the voices of the people who are participants in these various kinds of civic innovations. The big backdrop, though, of this whole history, I think, is one of these three big important trends that have been going on for a while. And one is, the most massive one, is that since the National Civic League was formed 100 years ago, we've gone from a population that was mostly illiterate, or to a large extent illiterate, where very few people actually had degrees of any kind, to a population today of very high levels of literacy, numeracy, skills, and degrees. That's an enormous shift. Another one is in terms of people's attitudes toward authority. So the people's deference toward any kind of authority, religious, political, cultural, that basically peaked in the early 1970s and has been going way, way down ever since. So people are simply less likely to defer to experts, to electeds, to other kinds of authority figures. And then the last or most recent big enormous trend is, of course, the internet, which over the last 25 years has had all these big impacts on democracy and the way we connect in communities. It's probably We're probably in the midst of a whole second wave of changes based on digital technologies. We can talk more about that. But it's another thing that is affecting how citizens connect and how they are part of governance. When I say citizens, by the way, I mean people. What I mean are people who live in their communities, who have a stake in their communities, who have rights, responsibilities, contributions that they can make. So citizens I'm using in the broadest sense possible. So we got these three waves of civic innovation. One I'm going to talk about first has to do with in-person, small group, deliberative processes, and that starts in like the early 1990s and kind of it goes through the early 2000s. Then there's a second wave, which is taking advantage of all the things that the internet can give us, and that second wave of digital platforms and apps and tools starts in the probably late 2000s and is kind of continuing today. And the third wave, we're not sure what it's going to look like. But for me, and I think maybe for a lot of us who've been doing this work for a while, a lot of this started in the mid-1990s with questions and concerns and frustrations related to race and equity in America, and the widespread acknowledgement that Americans needed to deal with issues of race and difference in ways that they never had before. And so things like Rodney King and his seemingly simple question, can't we all just get along? The O.J. Simpson trial, all kinds of things that happened in that time period convinced all kinds of people that we needed to kind of address this issue, and it convinced many elected officials and other leaders that this was something they actually had to engage citizens around. It wasn't something where they could just do legislation or make other kinds of decisions and solve the problems or deal. They realized people needed to talk to each other and to their institutions, and that was going to have to be part of the process. So they realized this need, but people, and not just elected officials, but all kinds of local leaders and informal and formal leaders realized that the processes they had for doing this, for getting people talking, didn't work. They still don't work. And they certainly didn't work at the time. And so, this is a picture of your typical 3 minutes of the microphone public meeting. People get up at a mic, or maybe sometimes it's 1 minute, as you were saying, but you get a very small amount of time to ask a question or make a statement, or sometimes just to yell at your elected officials. And that's not something where you're ever going to be able to address race or pretty much any kind of difficult, complicated issue. I also want to point out that we had this whole conversation earlier as part of the World Cafe, which, of course, the World Cafe is a civic innovation of this time period. And one of the things that you guys were having us talk about is what makes people feel heard. And some of the answers you were giving were things like, people, you see people, you make the eye contact, you get the physical cues, the facial cues, or things like, people recognize your expertise, or you have a particular title or status. There are certain ways in which people feel heard. None of them are evident here. Even down to the physical layout of the room. You've got the officials up there on a dais, they have name tags and microphones, they have comfortable chairs. Even physically, even those kind of facial and kind of physical kind of ways in which people can feel heard are not going to be satisfied through this sort of format. It is still far and away the most common format for city councils, school boards, hearings, planning and zoning, all kinds of public meetings in America. We all hate it. We keep doing it. We got to figure something out about this. So, in the absence of the official, settings that were going to be, helpful for this, people innovated. They started things like study circles and World Cafe and all kinds of small group deliberative processes, and most of them had some basic good practices at their heart. They were small groups, 10 people or so in the group. They had a facilitator who was there, not to educate the group or lecture people, but to kind of make sure people could talk and could use the information they were being given or analyze it together or use the time they had or whatever. They had kind of a sequence where people started by talking about their personal experiences. Before they got into the thornier questions related to race or another issue, they would talk about, why they cared. What things had happened in their lives that made them care about this issue, this community, their kids, their parents. And that from there, once people got those kinds of things off their chest and kind of shared them with one another, they were much better able to listen to one another and to come to agreement on things in which they disagreed. Another kind of basic practice here was laying out options for people, not just selling them on one particular answer, but saying, hey, we've got A, B, and C, and here are the pros and cons to each of them, what do you think? And then finally, kind of a core practice that emerged in this kind of wave of innovation was helping people plan for action and to think about action at multiple levels. What do you think the city council should do, or the mayor, or whoever, and what recommendations do we want to be giving that elected official or decision maker? What are the other ways you can make an impact in your community through the networks you're part of, or the organizations you belong to, or whatever? And then what can you do as an individual, even down to your own individual behavior? What can you do to do something about the issues we're talking about? So getting people to think about action at all those levels. And so one way of thinking about this type of innovation is these are thick forms of engagement. Thick, they're all about the small group. They're intensive, they're getting people to deal with each other, to hear each other, to learn stuff together. And in that process, which is always more time consuming to organize, more time consuming for people to participate in, there are still all kinds of great outcomes that occurred and can occur. And so, and part of that, though, I want to be clear, it wasn't simply that, you got a few people together in small groups. Usually, to have a range of impacts, you had to have a lot of people together. So it wasn't just one or two small groups in your community, you needed perhaps hundreds of them. And that was what gave the efforts the political will, the critical mass that would get decision makers to kind of go along with what people were recommending. It's what kind of initiated a lot of the kind of institutional, organizational action efforts people took. And also, by getting a large number of people involved, that maximized the impact of those people's behavioral changes, the individual things that they were going to do something about the issue. So you needed small groups, but in large numbers. And these things had some very worthwhile impacts. I just kind of picked a smattering of these. These were projects related and focused on race. And so in some cases, cities changed hiring practices for police and fire departments. In some cases, cities created new schools or libraries or shopping centers in areas where people didn't have access to good groceries and things like that. Lots of policing changes happened during this time period. Lots and lots of festivals, fairs, parades, things that kind of upheld diversity as a community value. So those are all kind of worthwhile things, and they're all kind of community-driven sorts of outcomes. Meanwhile, the proliferation of these efforts also influenced similar sorts of efforts on other kinds of issues, getting people to talk about how to improve the schools in their community, or how to do public budgeting together, or how to address issues of poverty or economic growth. So that some of these same kinds of good practices fit with some of those other issues as well. So race kind of set the template for a whole range of civic innovations of this time period. And again, these led to all kinds of interesting and cool outcomes. Some of them outcomes were more creative, I think, than anything that a city council or a planning commission might have come up with on its own. And this is my favorite example. This is a freeway overpass in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle. And basically, this was a problem spot for this neighborhood. People in this neighborhood had gone through a process where lots of people got into small groups to talk about things that they wanted to improve, and people talked about this. This was it's a dark place at night. There was crime, drug dealing was going on here. What are we going to do about this problem spot? And so, as part of this process where people talked about this, and they also had access to mini grants from the city of Seattle, and they decided with their mini grant that they were going to build a troll. So. This space and this troll is now a tourist attraction in the city of Seattle. It's on tourist maps. It's hard to get pictures like this because there's usually a line of people trying to get their picture taken in front of the troll. And it's just an example of, like, if you tap into the creativity and the energy and the skills, because clearly a bunch of artists were involved in this, the skills of people, they can come up with solutions to public problems that you might not have ever come up with otherwise. I also wanted to show this because when we talked in the call before this event, Ashley and Danae talked about the need to show concrete action steps people could take. Concrete for you. So, lots of great things happened out of this period, this wave of innovation, wonderful outcomes in communities, and it also fell short. And the main way it fell short was that it didn't really change systems or infrastructure in communities. There were lots of great processes, great meetings, great conversations people had, but they were only, for the most part, on the fringes. They didn't change how the official public meetings worked. They didn't change how the police department interacted with its citizens over a long-term basis. It just was a temporary sort of thing, and people liked it, but then it ended. Conventional engagement continues, like I said, on and on in every community. It was always inefficient in the sense that it was always very disconnected. So you had the police department trying to engage people on one issue, the school system on another, city hall on another, the Chamber of Commerce on something else, and they didn't ever, for the most part, join forces. They were always trying to engage their own niche of the market, niche of the community on their issues, and not kind of pooling their effort, their ideas, or their processes. And then, as I said, even in cases where you had projects that were wildly successful, seemingly, not all of them were, of course, but even ones that were really good and people liked them, and they had these various kinds of tangible outcomes, they were usually over, and the community would go back to the typical politics as usual of conventional public meetings and conventional processes. So let me stop there and ask you to talk to your neighbor for a few minutes. What do you think of this history so far? How does it compare to your experience? It is certainly acceptable to say, I wasn't alive in the 90s, Emily. But obviously, one can kind of have reflections on this, and there probably are some elements of this that you have experienced in your life today, even if you weren't around then. So let's talk for a few minutes about this, and we'll come back together and hear what you guys said. Okay, so anyone want to share a reflection of some kind from your conversation with your neighbor or neighbors about how this story connects or doesn't connect with your experience? Anyone? Hey.
Thank you. We talked about how coming from different communities, we're noticing different things. So we talked about a community in Brevard that it seems like you can't even talk with people anymore. The divisiveness seems so big. But then we talked about your community in New Hampshire, where because it was more homogeneous, is that how you described it? It was people were more welcome and willing to interconnect. And then I brought my experiences where in Hillsborough County were very diverse, and I was able to find a lot of commonalities with people. So we were just thinking, we don't think it's changed a lot. So we're definitely still seeing things, but still working around it.
That's absolutely encouraging. Good. Other thoughts or reflections?
Thank you. So one of the things we talked about in this safe and brave space is just given some of the legislative, and policies that have come down in the last couple of years, in my world in philanthropy and foundations, there's been a massive chilling effect in terms of organizations investing and or having conversations around equity and race. And I think my fear, after talking about how does this compare to your experience, is that it feels like we've taken not like 2 steps back, but 10 steps back on even having the conversation. Foundations like the one that we're in now, they're continuing to have these critical conversations, but it's not really useful if it's just an echo chamber of people that all agree on the same thing, and we're not having total diversity of thought on both sides to talk about these issues. And so where do we go from here, given that we live in Florida, and what does that mean? And how do we continue having these conversations where I would say the vast majority of the foundations who are part of my network are currently fearful to have them.
Absolutely.
I feel like I'm obligated to go because you called me out. So if you guys haven't met me yet, I am Emily. And one of the things is, yes, I was not alive in the 90s. But I do think that the issues, because you were talking about how it's small group deliberation was like the first wave in the 90s and stuff like that. But I think that that issue is like still prevalent now, and I think that that's almost like the problem is that we're having the small group deliberations, because why aren't they big group deliberations? Why aren't we advocating for all of voices to be heard in these deliberations? But then also, why are we only just talking and not acting? Um, and then also, like, in the 90s and like even now, we're making these problems for the future, like we're trying to make future solutions, but we're not encouraging and engaging our youth, who are the future in these decisions. But yeah.
Oh, yes, Emily for president. Donations now being taken. All right, I'll give you another chapter here, and we can talk about that one after a few minutes. But so returning to our story, we're fast forwarding to 2005 or so, and you've got this wave of tools and platforms and apps that take advantage of all the things the internet can do. And they are a variety of ways to empower the individual. They're thin forms of engagement as opposed to thick, and it doesn't mean that thick or thin is better. They're just different, and they complement each other well, actually. But with these digital tools, basically, you've got all these really interesting ways that people can show a preference for something. They can contribute an idea, give a rating, donate some money, or commit some volunteer time. The digital divides were clearly part of the conversation then. They still are, and they still exist now. They're very different today than they were 15, 20 years ago. So there were certainly differences as far as who could, in fact, access these types of engagement, who had the equipment, the skill, all those sorts of things. When they worked well, though, they were fast. They are fast, easy, convenient. They are closer to where people are, where they're living. And these days, many of us are living online as much as we are living in a kind of geographic world. They're also very easy to scale and aggregate. If you can get the right number of get people interested in them, they can move much more quickly than the face-to-face deliberative forms. So they have those kinds of advantages. And this is just kind of a quick sampler, a list of different kinds of tools and what they can do. Some of them are for crowdsourcing and ideation among sometimes very large groups of people. Some are allowing data gathering or feedback from people about everything from like, what do you think about this public policy, to, hey, there's a pothole here in the street, why don't you fix it, Public Works Department. There's ones for crowdfunding and crowdsourcing of various kinds. There's online petition engines like change.org. Lots of serious games where people learn about issues and kind of test their skills that way. There's lots of things that use the geolocation features of our technologies so that people can kind of contribute to the maps of their neighborhoods or their protests, various things like that. And then there are also some tools now for online deliberation, which is kind of crossing back over into thick types of engagement, just doing it online rather than in a face-to-face sort of world. And more uses, and certainly more and more apps and organizations they come and go all the time. This is just one example, and part of what this one reflects is the fact that at this time period also, you started to see some examples of interesting civic innovations from other countries make it to the US, particularly countries of the global south, such as Brazil, India, South Africa, and the Philippines. And so, and a lot of those were still kind of face-to-face forms of thick engagement, like participatory budgeting is one of the ones that people have encountered here. It started in Brazil in the late 80s. But others that were not just, thick engagement, things that like the government asks was a combination of thick and thin in the sense that they had in-person sorts of meetings and also online ways for people to get engaged, a bit like what we heard with Thrive 305 earlier today. And in this one, they had 360,000 people engage in this process to kind of decide the health policy for the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. For all these forms of engagement, whether it's thick or thin, 90% of the work is still getting people to engage. It's not easy. You can't just plan a good meeting and expect people to come. You can't just build a good website and expect people to visit it. You've got to actually get out there in a very proactive network-based sort of way, because the reason people engage in something is because somebody they know and trust asks them to do so. It's nice to have an article in the paper. It's great to have a website. It's good to have a mass email. Those are all good supplements, gives people information about what you'd be asking them to do. But the reason they're really going to do it is because their spouse, their parent, their kid, their neighbor, their colleague, their pastor, somebody they know and trust says, hey, we need you to come out Tuesday night, or hey, we need you to go to this website, or whatever you're asking them to do. So what you got to be doing in all these forms of engagement, these are very tried and true, very old civic innovations, is figuring out what do people belong to in your community, what are those networks, who's influential and trusted in those networks, who can I talk to who's going to help me bring people from this part of town that we're not hearing from as much, or these voices who are not heard in public decision making, or this age demographic that we aren't engaging. Kind of figuring out who is less likely to participate, who is influential in the networks of those people, and then figuring out how can I kind of tap into those relationships of trust and use both face-to-face and digital connections to get people to come out. Once again, even though there are all kinds of interesting, cool outcomes of this whole wave of efforts, they all fell short in various ways as well. The civic innovations that were digital innovations of the 2000s and 2010s, they didn't, just like the earlier wave, didn't change our civic infrastructure fundamentally. They didn't change the way that school systems, police departments, local governments, state governments interacted with their constituents. There were, again, lots of great individual things, great tools, great apps, as opposed to great meeting processes, but mostly disconnected from the systems. One of the sad things was that these two waves of innovators were not really that connected to one another, so they made a lot of the same mistakes, even though they were kind of in different, spoke very different kinds of language. And so this was a period where lots of really cool innovation, 1,000 flowers bloomed, but nobody did the gardening. And no one was figuring out, hey, this flower goes well with next to that one, and here's where we can plant the beans or whatever, to make a kind of a system that was going to work for people. So this is, again, a kind of a failure of our imagination, of our design thinking, to figure out how do these civic innovations fit together as part of a democracy that's going to work for everybody. So we can at least, I think, from thick forms of engagement, from thin innovations, and also certainly from what we are seeing in other countries, which in most cases are much more innovative democracies than we have here. Not that all other countries are democracies, but among the democracies, there's a lot of innovative stuff. And in fact, actually innovative stuff happening in countries which are not democratic at the national level. There's still some really interesting civic innovation going on in places like China, for example. But from all these examples, we can get some really interesting glimpses of what successful democracy can look like. And one of the kind of the threads that seems to come through in lots of places is a combination of thick and thin forms of engagement. They're different, they're good for different things, and they're often best when they're combined in one way or another. We were talking at our table earlier about ways you can kind of connect very small face-to-face conversations with one another through texting and through other kinds of apps where people get the intimacy and the directness of that face-to-face conversation, but they're also connected to what is in fact a statewide or national conversation on an issue that they care about. And that combination of I'm part of something that's meaningful here with this other person, and I'm also part of something that's big, that's an enormous, if you can have that kind of impact on people's minds, that's an enormous factor in terms of empowering them, as citizens. What successful democracy looks like, particularly in other countries, is it is social. And we talked a bit about this earlier today. One of our problems as a nation is that most of our political opportunities are serious. They're about public issues. They're data heavy. They're text heavy. It takes a lot of gumption to participate in them. A lot of people don't want to kind of go speak in front of a crowd. And whereas in other countries in particular, and certainly sometimes here in the US, if you can get people together around food or music or art or it's something that I can bring my kids to, those sorts of things, and you layer a little bit of engagement and a little bit of small p politics on top of that, that's a much more powerful, enduring base for our efforts when we have community life that's connected to our political lives. And you see that more in other countries. That's one of the reasons why some of those other countries are much more advanced democratically than we are. Certainly, a feature of successful democracy is giving people opportunities to talk about inequities of all kinds that they're facing, that they're dealing with, in ways they can do something about them, ways they can analyze and get data on what's actually happening and figure out what can be done about it, both at a policy level and also in other ways. Certainly, an aspect of successful democracy is leadership opportunities, particularly for new leaders, emerging leaders, people whose voices haven't been heard before, giving them settings where they can actually make some connections, feel heard, get some knowledge, get some resources that they can step forward. And then finally, you want to give people, the successful democracies are giving people a meaningful say on issues that they care about. And when I say meaningful say, that doesn't mean that they're deciding them necessarily. People lose. That's part of politics. People lose. But if you have enough faith in the process, the system, the leaders, the whole system, the whole infrastructure, then it's okay to lose once in a while. You don't lose your kind of sense of membership to the larger community. By the way, I think did Quijada mention Portsmouth Listens this morning when she was talking about New Hampshire? This is one of the first and greatest examples of thick engagement in America, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which starting in the mid-90s created this kind of ongoing process to get people engaged in influencing all kinds of decisions made by the city, the school board, and so on. So, what can we do about this? One thing that I think we can do as far as thinking about our next chapter in our story is think about how can we change this infrastructure? How can we move from these, cool, successful practices and tools to better, more enduring ways for communities to make decisions together? This is a picture of the newest edition of the Model City Charter, which the National Civic League has been maintaining since 1902. It gets updated every so often. The 9th edition came out a couple years ago. It is the first edition to embrace engagement and equity as two core principles of local governance. The charter is kind of the legal template for the relationship between cities and their citizens. Almost all cities have a charter or have to have a charter by state law. And it is a kind of a document that rules that infrastructure. It is something that can be changed and should be updated various times over, at various points over time. And one of the ways, of course, one can change it is by figuring out how to do better public meetings to kind of fix the kind of 3 minutes on a microphone format that everyone seems to hate, but we seem to doing it. And so this is a project that my center is actually involved in now. We're working with Boulder, Colorado, Mesa, Arizona, and Fayetteville, North Carolina to kind of incorporate some of these better forms of engagement into the way they do their official meetings. In Mesa, it's the school board. In Boulder, it's the city council. In Fayetteville, it's the police review board, and another commission in the community. And as part of that process, we do qualitative research, kind of like what Joe was talking about earlier today, to kind of figure out what is the history of engagement and democracy in this community. And we use this scorecard to get people to rate their meetings, and we then kind of figure out what the city could be doing differently, or the school system could be doing differently, both before, during, and then after the meetings that could kind of make people happier and create more productive conversations about the issues that these communities are dealing with. But that way of thinking about it is identifying a part of the infrastructure that is not working well and figuring out how to fix it. You can also look at it from the other way around and say, well, okay, what do we want to have happening in our community? What would be good for us? Well, one thing that would be good for us is information, disseminating information to people that's reliable, that's trustworthy, that helps them know what they need to know about their community. Information coming back from people in the form of input and data on various public problems and issues, that would also be an important thing. Discussing and connecting and socializing might also be effective and helpful for people. Giving them chances to kind of make decisions together on the small scale in their neighborhood, for their families, and so on. And then in the big scale, with the city, with the region, other kind of larger entities. And certainly encouraging their service, their volunteerism, what people call public work. That could be another kind of core ingredient of civic infrastructure, what you want your infrastructure to support in your community. So, and your picture might look different. Each community is different in terms of its needs and goals, but thinking about, well, what do we want to have happen here? And why is that important to us? And then thinking about, well, what is the infrastructure that can support that, both what governments and institutions should be doing, what community organizations, businesses, faith communities should be doing, libraries, what are the ways that the groups that we have, the laws that we have, can support what we want to happen in our communities. One final thing let me say about this is that one of the biggest social science findings over the last 20 years is the importance of strong community networks, strong social networks. Basically, people who have communities of support are much, and are kind of have relationships of various kinds. Those people are physically healthier. They are less susceptible to crime. They are less likely to be in poverty. They're more likely to be able to find jobs and childcare. They're better able to resist hurricanes and earthquakes and natural disasters. Social networks and the strengths of social networks are incredibly strong variables in these studies of community problems. So if you're doing engagement in such a way that you're not just getting some input on an issue, that's important. But if you're doing it in such a way that people are more connected to one another, you're actually perhaps doing the most fundamental thing to deal with some of the problems that we're all facing. And there's all kinds of reams of data and reams of research that will show that. Let me stop there and ask you to talk again to each other. What have you been able to do in your community, in a big way or a small way, to strengthen the civic infrastructure of a community? What's working about that? Or maybe you feel like you've been able to do that yet, but what would you like to do? What are you interested in doing based on your experiences or what you've heard today or any of those sorts of things? And we'll come back again in 5 minutes and get some more feedback. Okay, so anyone want to share something about how you've been able to change civic infrastructure in your community, or what you might want to change? Or something you tried to change but you couldn't?
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to monopolize the microphone. So it's kind of more of a question for you too, and it's something that we talked about, not necessarily about what hasn't worked, but just an idea of what could work. So I wondered what your thoughts were on compulsory voting. I used to live in Australia, and in Australia they have compulsory voting, which means that if you do not go to the booth to vote, then you will be fined. If you go to the booth to vote, you can go and say, I'm abstaining from voting, so you're not required to vote, but they will fine you. And so because of that, 93 or 94% of the population votes because they don't want to get fined. Also, employers want you to take the day off or definitely don't penalize you for going to vote. They also have like multiple parties, very interesting. But initially, as an American, I was like really horrified, like we can't make people vote and fine them. And then I lived there, I'm like, this is pretty great because people are showing up. And they also offered in the voting booths information on the candidates. So if like you say you weren't engaged, you would go and be like, well, I wasn't going to vote, but I might read this now. And they read about candidates and then vote. So it was like this more transparent process in that way with information, but didn't know if you had an opinion on that or if that would ever happen in the U.S.
I don't. I'm always looking for ways to kind of bring voting back in line, back together with other forms of civic engagement, because I think voting is absolutely essential. It's a bedrock of our system. It ought to be as easy to do as possible. It ought to be protected in all kinds of ways. And I am in support of all of those things, and I think they're just not enough. And that part of what we're up against here, not up against, but part of what has happened here in terms of kind of the change in citizens, in the kind of their, like a slide I was showing before, education levels, deference to authority, the internet. People don't just want to be represented. That's part of the thing. Yes, they want to be represented. They want city councils, they want school boards, they want Congress. They also want to be heard. And so voting, yeah, absolutely. There should be all of these protections and supports for voting. I'm not sure about compulsory voting, but I think it's a mistake to kind of simply kind of concentrate all one's efforts on voting when it's not enough for most people anymore. And so I think what we want to be doing is not kind of being very on the defensive and kind of defend the most basic elements of democracy like voting. We should be on the offensive. We should be proactive. What do people want? And how can we provide more of those things through our system, through our process? So I think, in ways to kind of combine those two things, I think are really, intriguing. By the way, ActiveVote.net, great app if you want to know kind of how to figure out like how your policy views compare with the state legislatures candidates you're going to be voting on, or the school board, or the judges. ActiveVote basically can do that for you. It's a cool little app that also connects you to other kinds of civic stuff happening in your community. Other things people have done or want to do. Go ahead.
Disqualifies for that. We had a really robust conversation about the Sunshine Law and its demerits and merits and how it could be tweaked to do what it was supposed to do without diminishing the capacity to collaborate as elected officials and to have more accessible public meetings. So that's one. The second one, the other thing, and this is not what we talked about, but are you familiar with Civic Lex? One of the things I like about that, and Matt will tell you what that is, but is that the opaqueness of government is really problematic. There's we talked about the Sunshine Law, and it was like Bola went, what? But that's a big deal. But the Civic Lex tries to get past that and does a good job, on my judgment, about with regard to engagement and with regard to sort of decoding what is really a very coded process of making decisions.
Yeah, so open meetings laws, like you say, most of the laws we have in the state level in the US and local ones are about at least date to the early 90s or before. So they're pre-internet. So they're kind of almost impossible to interpret given kind of 21st century conditions and tools and apps and things like that. You get all kinds of questions to city attorneys, like if two city council members are on a Facebook chat, is that against the law? I mean, there's all kinds of things where they're just in all kinds of ways need to be updated. That's one situation where the model city charter can be helpful, because here's this national thing that says, here, look, there's a new way to kind of be used, new kind of model for your legal framework in your community. Civic Lex is kind of an inheritor to, or a descendant of Portsmouth Listens. It's in Lexington, Kentucky. It's actually started by a guy who's an artist, and was just was trying to apply some of his creative talents and juices to local politics, and it's using a whole variety of engagement efforts, both thick and thin, in partnership with the city, with the library system, with the school district, to kind of get people involved in all kinds of issues in Lexington, Kentucky. It's a terrific project. They're doing some statewide stuff now, so it's definitely one to look at. Jessica.
So one of the things, So one of the things that we discussed was how to increase civic engagement in order to increase or strengthen civic structure. So talking about youth and thinking about art, how do we use these humanities to increase youth engagement? And it led to a conversation of a photographer, or no, of a planner who does civic engagement or addresses issues within the community through photography. And we're like, okay, if we want to engage the youth, they're really big on Instagram, social media, and all that stuff, but it has its drawbacks. Because going back to it, or Marissa was saying that everything is curated. You don't get the reality of the real issues that are happening in this neighborhood because everything is curated. So it's true. That makes sense. And then me just going over successful or what do successful democracies look like, and doing what other countries are doing, is that very social. Yes, the internet can be a very social platform, but you can connect, but you're not building relationships, and that's the difference. Yeah, we can connect online, all that stuff, but relationship making comes through like, hey, how are you? What's your name? I'm Jess. Body language. So yeah, it's giving us a little bit more to think about.
Well, just to add to what you were talking about, one of the fastest growing forms of civic infrastructure of a type that has great potential is these hyper-local online spaces, right? So it's a combination of the face-to-face, hey, how you doing, with, oh, we can actually communicate at 11 p.m. because so things like email listservs, Facebook group pages for our neighborhood, and now Nextdoor. It had proliferated dramatically. They have had some negative kinds of consequences to them because Nextdoor, as you may remember a few years ago, was a place where there was a lot of racial profiling, things going on, people reporting crimes, but based on kind of what they thought might be occurring because of their perceptions of the people that they were seeing. So it's not like it has drawbacks, but also great potential because it's that combination of, oh, I can see this person in the grocery store and I have a relationship with that person and I'll want, therefore, to understand them better, plus the convenience and the information sharing of this online platform. So that's something, and we were talking about your work as a planner earlier, I was thinking of asking you about that. So the more we can figure out how to improve those hyperlocal online spaces and interact with them in other kinds of situations, I think that's a great opportunity for engagement.
So hi, I'm Emily again. So, so funny. So I think that one of the things, like as far as like the youth go as well. So I was like a YMCA national and state youth advocate, but nationally we were able to advocate in Washington D.C. to our congressional members about like more money and more funding for civic education and students, because it's actually found that like federally the allocations for funding for STEM students are like $16 per student, as opposed to a civic student's like a few cents, like 60 cents, something like that. But one thing that was like really cool though is that a few months, like a month later, in Joe Biden's budget proposal for the legislature, he said that he wanted to allocate $100 million or something like that dollars for civic education, and I was like, oh my gosh, advocacy matters. Obviously it does, but that was kind of cool. The legislature didn't actually like approve of us like to have more money, but still it's like a step in the right direction and like the baby steps that actually do matter. But as far as like engaging citizens and like inspiring them to like speak, I feel that there's like 100% a need for civic education and a want for that engagement, especially among the youth. Because like at my own high school in Lee County, I go to North Mars High School. Like I think it was last year, the year before, we had the Don't Say Gay bill that came up in Florida. A lot of students were just hating on it because of what social media had opposed of it and what social media had brought upon it. However, none of them actually read the written legislation and the written proposed legislation, and they didn't even know like the House bill number. So they're over here protesting in like our school parking lot because our principal allowed us to do so. But they're advocating for the anger that social media proposed on them and not the anger within themselves from reading legislation. And that's almost because there's no like proper civic education for them to understand where that hatred came from that social media taught them. So it's almost kind of like bridging that gap of like, yes, we know you want to protest, we know that you're a citizen, we know that you have that need, but let's teach you how to do it properly in a public policy way that you can actually make that change in advocacy. But yeah. So.
Awesome. All right, I only got one more chapter here of the story, and then we're done. Another thing that we can be doing, and I know this is repeating some of what Kihara and then Joe talked about, another thing we can do which has an impact in a variety of ways is measuring civic infrastructure, measuring democracy, both in terms of the individual, the civic readiness of a person, what knowledge they have, what skills they have or might need, and also the civic opportunities that a community has to give people opportunities to exercise those skills, to learn more, all those sorts of things. Kind of what Joe was talking about, the Civic Infrastructure Index is kind of one of those sorts of measures. This wheel is from a report that we did in partnership with Institute for Citizens and Scholars. It's called Mapping Civic Measurement. You can find it online. But basically what we tried to do is just like find all the different tools people were using to measure civic readiness and civic opportunities and kind of group them in various ways. An important thing about measurement is if you want to measure something, you have to define it. And you have to decide and talk about why is it valuable. And so that's a really important kind of process in and of itself. And it can be a really interesting bridging conversation. I mean, Emily, part of what you mentioned with civic ed is an important bridging conversation. That's one of the only things nationally that has kind of bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats both agree on various aspects of improving civic ed. It also can happen in an interesting way in a community where when you get people talking about what they want to measure and defining it, they understand or begin to understand that in fact they value some of the same sorts of things. They may be calling it by different labels. using different language to describe some of the same sorts of stuff. So figuring out what do you want to measure can be an interesting bridging conversation in any community. I think we also need lots of tools that are not just kind of used by researchers or by governments or institutes, but ones that people can use themselves, that are kind of user-centered rating tools. And we need more things like Yelp for civic engagement. And so actually one of the things we did in my center was create, and actually this started several years before that, Kihara and I worked on it together at Public Agenda. We created a Yelp for civic engagement called a Civic Engagement Scorecard, getting people a chance to rate their public meetings. And this, so right now we're using this in that Better Public Meetings project I described earlier. This is the bolder version. So basically it's giving people a chance, to say very simply, the whole thing is supposed to take 2 minutes on your phone. Say very simply, did you like this? Not so much, or somewhere in between. Smiley face, frowny face, or in the middle. And then there's a few more questions that you can't see below the fold here, but basically giving them a chance to kind of rate really quickly their public meeting. And if you think about all the public meetings you have been to that are 3 minutes at a microphone or 1 minute at a microphone, and kind of anticipate what people's ratings might be for those, you can begin to sense the way in which measurement by large numbers of people can in fact have an impact on public officials and civic infrastructure in a community, because officials don't want to do things that people say they don't like. And so when you have numbers and ratings which show that people don't like something, there's a kind of an impetus to to change it. Another thing that the scorecard does is get people to talk about and rate their community, and not just kind of government or the meetings, but rate their community overall in terms of whether they feel connected, whether they feel informed, whether they feel they have a meaningful say on decisions that they care about, and whether they feel their volunteerism and their service is supported and honored. So 4 dimensions of civic life, service, information, decisions, and connections. And this part of it is kind of based more on ratemyprofessor.com than Yelp. It's basically giving people tags, easy for them to click on tags that kind of reflect their experience. But this is a way of kind of helping people figure out, not just what kind of job is government doing, but it's giving more data generally on the civic life of the community. It's communicating that improvement is possible. If you're going to measure something, that kind of carries with it the idea that, oh yeah, you could maybe get a better score next time. This can be improved. It's showing how public meetings and institutions actually rely and connect with other aspects of community. And it can communicate that it's not just government's job or the school systems or the universities or whatever. It's the job of all those institutions and all of us as citizens to kind of figure out how to strengthen civic life in our communities. You can, by the way, try out the scorecard. That's the bit.ly link. It's case sensitive, so you have to make sure you got capital letters in the right spots. This is also a concrete tool you can use. We actually offer this for free. So if you want a scorecard for your community, you just basically let us know, and we'll create your own kind of profile and data bucket, and you can then use it and get people rating things in your community. Another thing I think that might be helpful in kind of moving forward with this work generally is clarifying that this is not about the older ways of thinking about politics and public life. Civic work is not innately progressive, it's not innately conservative, at least according to the traditional kind of ideas there. I mean, and it challenges progressives and conservatives in various kind of interesting ways. I mean, it challenges the progressive notion that that experts should be making the decisions, and the conservative notion the elected should be making the decision by saying that no, citizens have a role to play in being part of the decision making. It makes government more accountable to citizens, which is something that conservatives like. It gets people to raise their trust in government, which is something that progressives like. It also kind of asserts that, unlike what you sometimes hear from progressives, which they kind of act like sometimes that government is the problem solver, or conservatives who kind of act like government can solve no problems whatsoever, basically says, well, look, in between, citizens can be part of problem solving in partnership with government, in partnership with businesses and other entities in their communities. So it is kind of a different animal, ideologically, than any of these kind of older left or right sorts of ideas in American life. Another thing we can do is get more learning going across borders. This is a picture of this event we organized last fall, the Global Innovations in Democracy Parliamentary Exchange in Capitol Hill. We had senators from Brazil, congresspeople from Argentina, members of the German Bundestag, members of the European Parliament come to Washington and meet with 12 members of Congress. It was a really interesting conversation. The people from the other countries were much more experienced with working with their constituents in various kinds of participatory ways. Most of the members of Congress couldn't actually believe that that was possible, so it was kind of eye-opening for them. The turning point in the conversation was when the senator from Brazil spoke up, and this is last November, so the Brazilian election where Bolsonaro got defeated was in October. And this was right after Bolsonaro was trying to kind of get a coup going so that he'd stay in power. And so the Senator Costa from Brazil said, you know, the reason why we have not had a successful coup in Brazil is because in Brazil, we have given people lots of different day-to-day ways that they can be involved in their democracy, in budgeting, in local health councils, and all kinds of things. They have daily experience of democracy, and they know what they're defending. And the members of Congress all said, ooh, that was one that was an argument that kind of got through to them and made them realize we're talking about something different here. And there's maybe some reasons to do this that we didn't even recognize before. So obviously this could be happening. You can be doing, we're trying to do it again. We've actually had to postpone this year's because of the government shutdown and the House Speaker situation. It's going to happen in April. You can be doing it at the national level, but this also can be happening at the community level. I mean, our communities have people from all over the world in them. You know, and the American attitude is often that, well, people came from terrible places to come to America. Well, that's not always true. People are also coming from places that are very interesting political, cultural places with interesting democracies, and we can probably learn something from them. So there's a variety of ways that we can actually have learning across borders about how we can be doing democracy better. I hesitate to bring this up because this is a whole presentation in of itself, but one thing that we are all going to have to be dealing with is the way in which AI is changing democracy already. We don't even know it. And the wonderful potential that AI can bring in all kinds of ways, and the very real threats, especially to equity, that it presents and is already producing. The basic situation here was we have this kind of adcollision course. You know, on the right, this kind of conscious engagement, all the things that we've been talking about, you know, all the ways in which people are trying to be heard, trying to activate, trying to, you know, advocate for things. They want to contribute things, they want to solve problems. They're frustrated about not being heard. That's more true than ever before. That conscious engagement is going on. At the same time, we have subconscious technologies, by which I mean technologies which are taking advantage of the fact that there's quadrillions of bytes of data about us that are out there. We don't even know it. And there are these tremendously powerful computers which can crunch that data in various ways and can make predictions about what we want or need, may be true, that can kind of forecast risks and of all kinds, that can micro-target us by knowing so much about us, that they can micro-target us in terms of our data, of our messages that will kind of influence us in various ways. These subconscious technologies can automate interactions so much that you don't know whether you're interacting with a person or a bot. And they can also, of course, monitor and surveil us through facial recognition and all kinds of things. This is an enormous force which is shaping all kinds of things in public life now. I was having kind of a disturbing conversation with a guy who works for a big city. He does civic engagement, and he's a tech guy. And he said, you know, you got to understand that the part of the city government that is best able to take advantage of AI because of the staffing, the money, the tech they already have, it's not my department. He works for the Civic Engagement Commission. It's not the housing department. It's not the planning and zoning people. It's the police department. Police departments have the staff, they have the tech, they have the money. And so some of the aspects of AI that we are most concerned about in terms of surveillance, facial recognition, all kinds of things, are the things that those are the things that because of who's in City Hall, those are the ones that are probably going to be the ones that are most used most quickly. And I don't mean to say that one should always automatically be distrustful of police departments. I'm just pointing out kind of a fact of life about most city governments, which is that there is more investment now and more staffing and more tech capacity in some parts of the organization than others. we can also do something simpler, which is to celebrate successes. And these are pictures from the All-America City Awards, which the National Civic League has held for the last 75 years. Basically what happens is that people apply, the cities apply, they're supposed to, in their application, highlight 3 cool civic projects that they do, and they all come to Denver for this event. Each city brings between 20 and 60 people as a delegation to kind of make their presentation. And of course their applications are, they're full of numbers and facts about what they've been able to achieve in their communities. But it's also, so it's about serious stuff, but it's also a party. Each of these 20 cities make a presentation to the jury, and it's full of dance and singing and chanting and funny skits and all kinds of things. And so it's a way of, and the delegations themselves are tremendously inspiring because they're politically diverse, racially diverse, age diverse. You've got kids, you've got senior citizens, you've got government people, business people, nonprofits. The All-America City Awards give you a much more uplifting picture of what civic life in America can actually be and is than you would ever get from most national media or most of the coverage of the way we supposedly all hate each other. So things like that, where we kind of call out what people are actually doing together across their divisions in their various diversity to kind of improve their communities, that's really important to be celebrating and pointing out those things. I think Cameron had to go, but Cameron and I are organizing a national version of this in a month. It's the Conference on Citizenship. It too has been going on for many years. We're trying to infuse some of the flavor of the All-America City Awards into this national conference, but it too will be kind of highlighting a lot of the success stories that we're seeing around the country. One of the things we're going to be releasing there is this map of all the healthy democracy organizations in America. We have a database now of 10,000 organizations. We're going to be showing kind of where they are geographically, how they're connected to each other, how they're funded, all those sorts of things. So we're trying to kind of walk the talk as far as kind of showing, what civic life can be like. Any other successes people want to kind of shout out here in the last couple seconds that you want to celebrate in Florida? Yeah? Just shout it out. 2 words. Awesome. And a great example of kind of working together to do engagement better across the institutions, across the systems, which so rarely happens.
But one thing I found is that the same people over here in this government entity and this government entity doing the exact same work didn't know each other.
Yeah.
So we're trying to bridge that gap.
I see that all the time. It's so frustrating. It's like, why don't you have lunch once in a while and compare notes? Yeah. Any other successes people want to shout out? Recognizing one another. This is a success, by the way, and I want to thank you all. I thank Bob and Tim and everyone involved in putting this together because it's a way of kind of recognizing great stuff.
I just really like the microphone. So, no, I want to celebrate a success, even though the outcome wasn't the positive. I want to celebrate a success, even though the outcome wasn't positive. It was a success because it was really insightful. I think I spoke it with my table, but I think you were in my table. Perceptions of affordable housing. Okay. So Sarasota, the demographics, retired community, very educated, very well off. Apartments, for some reason, people think that it's low-income housing. I don't know why, but that's not the case. Okay, so one success is that we took this planning activity that we typically do with students, and this time we decided to do it with adults. It was really fun because you saw the fun, creative, childlike thing that we lose when we become old. As we get older, we lose our creativity, we lose our sense of playfulness. No, but in general, because we really get bogged down with life, you know? So it was really cool to see that, but the outcome was great, but it was really insightful to see perceptions towards development and where people are coming from. So as planners, it was really interesting to understand the perceptions, even though it's not what we wanted to hear, but it was really good because it gave us a chance to know our community more in a very playful and fun manner. And that was the great thing about it, because we were able to point out their biases with laughter. And that was great. It was great. So I think that was a success. Shout out to Tassian for helping out at that.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, and thank all of you for doing this work, because, you know, it is so important. And in a variety of ways, you all are providing answers to these amazing questions about what kind of civic infrastructure do you want? What kind of civic life do you want? What kind of democracy do you want? That is a question that is worth asking. Every community may have a different answer, but as long as the community has an answer that genuinely represents the people who live there and it works for them, who cares? What kind of democracy do you want? So thank you for helping other people ask that question and figure out what they want to do and what vision they want to realize for themselves and their communities.